Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Many people who've taken their first Covishield injection are now asking themselves, when should they take the second injection? Should it be after a gap of 28 days as the government has advised? Or should it be after a gap of something between 8 and 12 weeks as the World Health Organization guidelines officially stipulate? That's the critical question I shall put today to the director of the Trivedi School of Biosciences at Ashoka University and India's top virologist, Shahid Jameel. Professor Jameel, what is your answer to that critical question? Should the second Covishield injection be taken after a gap of 28 days as the government of India has advised, or should it be after a gap of somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks as the World Health Organization has officially stipulated in its guidelines?
All right. Firstly, Karan, thank you for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure to be back. So the answer to your question is complicated, and it depends on the ground situation. First, let me address the biology. So the response after the first shot peaks in about 2 weeks. And then after peaking, it starts going down and it goes down rapidly over the next few weeks. Now, how rapidly it goes down will vary between individuals. The second shot is a booster shot that quickly raises the immune levels with full protection within 1 week. Now, even this response, which is the booster response or the secondary response, wanes off, but it wanes off much more slowly than after the first shot. So essentially, immunity is long lasting after the second shot. How long would depend upon individuals and the pathogen in question. Now, the best immunity is developed if the booster shot is taken after the first response has come down to almost baseline levels. This would actually mean testing for antibody levels periodically or at least before the second shot. If antibodies were still high at that point, you can delay, otherwise, take the second shot. Now, having said this, this may be the best approach, but it is not the most practical approach. Each antibody test, each test to quantify antibodies in blood currently costs about 1,000 rupees in India, which is 4 times the cost of a dose of vaccine. The second issue is that it is not, nobody is fully protected unless you take the second dose. The priority for the population really at this time should be to get protected as quickly as possible to ward off any surge in infections. So I would therefore go with 4 weeks and not delay to 8 to 12 weeks, as the WHO says in India. And we can discuss why in India a little later. Uh, Individuals who have the capacity to get tested before taking the second shot may do so, but they do that with the full understanding that they will not get full protection in the interim period. As long as they understand that, it should be all right.
I'm just going to repeat what I believe is the nub of your answer so that audiences can concentrate on that. You're saying if you're going to delay taking the second dose of Covishield beyond the government stipulated 28 days, it's advisable to only do so after doing an antibody test and ensuring that you have high levels of antibody. But you're also saying that since that antibody test is A, 4 times more expensive than Covishield, and secondly, it's not an easy or practical thing to do, it might be wiser and safer to take the second dose after 28 days rather than delay. Have I understood
Right.
correctly?
Yes. Yes.
And you're
Yes.
also
That's
saying
exactly.
you're also saying by implication, people should not delay beyond 28 days if they haven't taken an antibody test because they won't know what their levels of antibody is at. And therefore, it may have dipped very low and they may be endangering themselves by delaying it. That is a corollary to what you're saying.
Right. And I'm also saying that at a programmatic level, it is not possible for everyone to be taking an antibody test. And therefore, from a pro- program point of view, from a population point of view, it's best to stick to the 4-week schedule.
Absolutely. For the country as a whole, because not everyone can afford to take an antibody test,
Right,
it is wise to stick to 4 weeks. Those
right.
who can afford it must make sure they've done an antibody test before they decide to increase the gap. Because if they increase the gap beyond 28 days without doing an antibody test, you could find that their antibody levels have dipped, their protection, therefore, is now minimal, and they are endangering themselves by delaying it. That is the
Yes.
truth of what you're saying. Now, let me ask you a couple of further questions. To what extent is your advice that the second shot of Covishield should be taken after 28 days, not after a gap of 8 to 12 weeks, something that also factors in the nutritional status of the Indian people?
Yes. So there are actually many studies to show that vaccine effectiveness is linked to nutritional status of individuals and populations. Vaccine effectiveness is also reduced in people with chronic conditions such as diabetes, for example. India, as you would be aware, has an estimated 77 million people with diabetes, which makes us the second most affected country in the world after China. 1 out of every 6 people in the world with diabetes is an Indian. And you also know that diabetes is an important comorbidity in severe COVID. So, both nutritional status as well as comorbid conditions such as diabetes put us at further risk if we delay getting fully protected.
So, bearing in mind the fact that the nutritional status of Indian people is not the same, by no means the same as that of people in Europe and America, and
Right,
secondly, given that a lot of people have diabetes or other comorbidities, these again are two further reasons for
right.
ensuring the gap between the first and the second Covishield is only 28 days, not 8 to 12 weeks, as the WHO suggests. From a nutritional point of view and a comorbidity point of view, it's important to stick to just the 28-day gap.
Right.
Let me now put what, in a sense, is a flip question to you. In Britain, which was the country that pioneered expanding the gap from the recommended 28 days to
Mhm.
something like 10 weeks, it was done at a time when cases were surging in the United Kingdom, and it was
Right.
believed this was the best way of ensuring that the widest possible number of people got at least one dose of vaccine as quickly as possible. Now, as you and I speak, cases are also picking up in India. Why
Yes.
then is the British procedure or recourse not the right one for us at this point of time?
Well, see, a pandemic vaccine, in my view, should be doing three things. One is to protect frontline workers. The second is to reduce mortality. And the third is to interrupt the pandemic. The vaccine rollout in India actually adheres to these principles, and it makes a very sensible strategy. You have seen how we have gone and first vaccinated healthcare workers and frontline workers, and have now moved to vaccinating people who are older, people who have comorbidities. And you're absolutely right with the surge that we see in many states, and it's no longer limited to Maharashtra and Punjab. There are many other states where increases are happening. There are also new variants coming in, although at this point there is no evidence that variants are having any community transmission. But with all this put together, I would again say we cannot afford to delay protection.
But
Uh,
you're also
we,
saying that despite the surge, which is in many states not just two or three, and despite the threat of variants, you're still
right.
saying a 28-day gap is better than expanding the gap to somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks. You're still saying 28 days is best.
I'm still saying 8 to 12 days because you don't really get full protection after just one dose.
In other
Uh,
words, you are actually taking a position which is not just different to the British, but the opposite of the British. And it's also not just different to the WHO, but the opposite to the WHO. You disagree with both of them.
Well, I guess you could say that, but what I'm actually saying is that we are lucky that we are getting vaccine at a point where the numbers are relatively lower in India. In Britain, the situation was that they were vaccinating very close to the peak. We are not. Our numbers have started to go up, but we are much below our peak, which happened in September. If
Okay.
it was September, I would say go ahead and give one shot to as many people as you can. But the fact is that in India today, we are in a very comfortable position that we don't have a lack of vaccine doses. In fact, our limitation is being able to get vaccine into the arms of people.
So, given your point is given that we are nowhere near our peak, even though numbers are rising again, we are way below our peak. You stick
Right.
with the advice, take the second Covishield after 28 days. You don't believe there's a need to follow WHO guidelines or the British practice and expand the gap to something like 10 weeks. You're sticking to 28 days.
I'm sticking to 28 days, 4 weeks, because that's how vaccines were tested. That's how their efficacy was determined, and I'm sticking to that.
And in fact, I infer from what you're saying that although different scientists in different parts of the world have come to slightly different conclusions about the gap, there is on the one hand the British and the WHO who say the gap should be between 8 and 12 weeks. On the other hand, there is the Indian government and yourself who believe that in fact the gap should stay 28 days, which, by the way, and this is important to note, is also what the makers of the vaccine themselves have recommended, that the gap should be 28 days. You believe,
You know,
given the
yeah,
differences in scientific interpretation, the safe thing to do, and therefore the practical and wise thing to do, is stick to 28 days.
yes, and the science provides evidence-based solutions, and it's also context dependent in some sometimes. And here the context for India is very different from the context that you see in UK, for example. All this business is really based on a meta-analysis that was published in the British medical journal Lancet on 6th of March, where the Oxford vaccine group looked at 4 different studies, clinical trials that they had done on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which we called Covishield in India, where they compared immunogenicity and protection levels after the first dose and after the second dose.
Right.
And based on that, they have recommended that if you read that paper, it says very clearly, if supplies are limited, you may consider extending the second dose to 8 to 12 weeks.
Now that's an interesting point. The
Yes.
advice given to the UK government by AstraZeneca and Oxford University in Britain was if supplies are limited. That's a
Yes.
very important consideration. And that's why you said how a vaccine is taken is just not medically determined, it's also context determined. And the Indian
Absolutely.
context is very different in 3 critical ways to the context in the United Kingdom when they decided to expand the gap to 8 or 12 weeks. A, there is the nutritional difference in the people. Secondly, there's the high level of comorbidities, in particular diabetes. Thirdly, we are way off our peak, even though numbers are rising. Britain, when they gave this advice, were actually at their peak. And of course, finally, as you pointed out, there is no shortage of supplies in India. The vaccine, we make the vaccine locally. There was at that time in Britain concern about sufficient supply. Let me ask you
Right.
this then. Will you yourself, when you take your second dose, make sure that the gap between the first and second is just 28 days? Is that something you also plan to do for yourself?
Well, I do plan to do that. Uh, I I can afford to get the antibody test done, so I will get the test done. But I'm not recommending that everyone gets the test done. I'm just being honest with you. Since I understand the business a little bit better than the average person, I would go ahead and get the test done.
Let me ask you this question on behalf of members of the audience who may be able to afford getting an antibody test done just as you are able to afford it. The question they will ask is, what reading should the antibody test at the end of 28 days show so that they can decide whether they need to have the second jab immediately or whether they can afford to wait for a few more weeks? What should the reading be?
Well, the consensus is that if you have levels anywhere above 10 international units, then that is considered to be protective. So if you're getting close to 10 international units, I would say if you're getting below 100 international units, go ahead and get the second dose. If you are above 100 units, 100 international units in the quantitative antibody test, you may consider delaying it.
Just a bit of clarification. You began by saying 10 international units, you ended by saying 100. Which of the two do you mean?
10 is the threshold. I don't want you get at the threshold,
Okay.
because at the threshold, you will not have protection. Okay. So if you are above the threshold, sufficiently above the threshold, you can consider delaying. But if you are close to the threshold, take the second shot.
So if you get something like 20 or 30, does that give you sufficient confidence to delay?
No. That's why I revised it saying if you're getting around 100 or close to 100, go ahead, get the second shot.
Okay, that's very clear. When you do the antibody test to decide whether you should delay taking the second jab beyond 28 days, you should have an antibody result of around 100.
Right.
Around 100. Just for argument's sake, we should say somewhere between 80 and 100, but not lower.
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah. Let's not pick on those details, but yeah, you get the drift.
By coming to the end of this interview, how long can they delay it for if members of the audience find after 28 days their threshold is, say, 70 to 100? How long can they delay it for?
I wouldn't delay it for too much longer. Maybe get it in another week or 2 weeks max.
Oh, so in other words, the antibody test which shows a result of somewhere around 70 to 100 only gives you another week or 2 weeks max, nothing much more.
Yeah, so you don't really know. See, you don't really know how quickly your antibodies are going down. Ideally, you know this if you're getting tested regularly. Now, that is not practical. You can't be getting tested every week.
But then you're saying something very important. Even if you do an antibody test that permits you to delay beyond 28 days, you're also saying don't delay beyond 6 weeks altogether.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
And therefore, what it follows is this, that the most you can end up delaying, if one follows your advice, is from 28 to 42 days. That gives you another 14 days. You might as well take it after 28 and be done with and avoid both the tension and the cost of the antibody test.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. Yes. So, Karan, in the end, let me just repeat myself. These vaccines have been tested with 4 weeks between the doses. To somebody who doesn't really understand the details, I would say 6 weeks may still be okay. But we don't know if 12 weeks would really work for our population with our nutritional status and chronic conditions such as diabetes. Therefore, to not complicate things, I'm staying with 4 weeks as a general rule. And, we cannot let best be the enemy of good here.
Absolutely.
You're getting good protection, go get it. Don't worry about getting the best protection.
So the conclusion, Professor Jameel, and I'll put it in a nutshell, is this. The wise and safe course is take the second Covishield injection after 28 days. But if you want to delay it, make sure you have an antibody test. Make sure it shows levels of antibody somewhere between 70 and 100. But then also, do not delay it beyond a total of 42 days altogether. And therefore, that's a second reason for saying, It's easier, simpler, and probably cheaper to do it after 28 days and be finished.
Absolutely.
Don't bother about
Absolutely.
antibody tests. Don't bother
You'll
about...
you'll get sufficient protection. You'll get it immediately. It'll be over with. Don't worry about whether you'll be protected for a year, 2 years, 5 years. We don't know any of that yet.
Absolutely. Let's not even go into that. We don't know how long the protection lasts. That we'll find out about later. For now, we want to get protected. Let's not worry about how long it lasts. My last question.
Right.
All this discussion has been about Covishield because, in fact, the British and the WHO specifically came out with the delaying advice with Covishield in mind. Does it also apply to the other vaccine in India, Covaxin?
No, I have not seen any studies with Covaxin that looks at this. So I would say it's only for Covishield.
So as far as Covaxin is concerned, stick to the government's position. Make sure you have your second dose in 28 days. If Covaxin is the one you took first, don't even think about delaying it. Simply take it 28 days as required.
Right. The Covaxin trials were done with a 4-week duration. That's the efficacy that we know is based on 4-week difference between the two doses.
All right, Professor Jameel, that is crystal clear. The bottom line is the safe and sensible thing for everyone to do is to take the second Covishield after 28 days. I won't repeat what you said about extending it. I'll simply point out that at most you're suggesting a method of extending up to 42 days, which is not much of an extension. And you also said with specific regard to Covaxin, the Bharat Biotech vaccination, stick to the government advice and make sure you have your second jab 28 days later. Thank you very much, Professor Jameel. You've clarified the matter for everyone. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.